What's going on, AP World? We have Chapter 39 of the American Pageant for you today. Just a reminder that you can download this PowerPoint by following the link in the description to take you over to apushReview.com. All right, we're going to start talking about the 1970s and stagnation, or a slow economy. So let's analyze what were the reasons for economic downturn. Well, keep in mind, the early 1970s, the Vietnam War is still occurring, and there is a very high cost to fight a war. Wars are very expensive. We also have rising oil prices, most notably beginning in 1973 with the oil embargo, which we'll talk about. We also have inflation, in which their prices rise. There's too much money in circulation. And here is the history of inflation in the United States. And you'll notice that between the end of World War II in the early 1950s up to the 1970s, there's a 25-year gap of pretty low inflation, but the 1970s has very high inflation, and they also have unemployment, high unemployment. An important thing to know: high unemployment and high inflation, that is called stagflation. That is a deadly, deadly combination for economies. And other reasons for this economic downturn is that there is high funding for the Great Society, so high costs of the Great Society under LBJ. All right, we'll talk about Nixon and his policy of Vietnamization. This is gradually withdrawing U.S. troops from Vietnam. He campaigned on this on slowly ending the Vietnam War. And this led to transitioning the military burden to the South Vietnamese from the Americans. And one way they would transfer this burden is by using weapons, training, and advice, providing those, not necessarily having the U.S. provide troops anymore, but the U.S. would provide weapons, training, and advice for those leaders. Nixon also issues something that becomes known as the Nixon Doctrine, and this stated that the U.S. would honor their current commitments in defeating communism, but in the future, Asian countries would defend themselves without American troops. So this really is limited to Asia. Doves and hawks are two groups that are known during this time, and doves are those that favored peace, and hawks are those that favored war. And if you think back, the first time you really hear hawks is this term war hawks from the War of 1812, and the most notable war hawk was Henry Clay. Yes. Nixon appealed to the silent majority, this term that he coined, and the silent majority was Nixon's belief that most Americans in fact supported the war, but they were not vocal about it. So they were not the protesters out protesting the war. He believed that that was actually a minority of the population, while most Americans did support the war. In 1968, we have one of the worst atrocities of the Vietnam War, the My Lai massacre. And this is a picture of women and children from the massacre. And according to its source, which you can find on Wikipedia, some people who were there at this time said these individuals were killed within seconds of this photo being taken. And this happens in South Vietnam, in which American troops kill hundreds of Vietnamese women and children for apparently no reason. It's very, very sad. Let's go to Cambodia. This plays a very important role in the Vietnam War. On April 29th, 1970, Nixon ordered the U.S. to begin attacking Cambodia, a neighboring neutral country. So we have Vietnam here, and next to Vietnam is Cambodia. And Nixon believed that Cambodia was secretly providing aid to the North Vietnamese. When news of this gets out, this leads directly to, and you absolutely have to know this, the Kent State protests. And it was student protests in Kent State University, which is located near Cleveland, Ohio. As a result of the protests, the National Guard is called in to quell this protest. Shooting starts to occur, and 4 students are killed and many more are injured. And this makes national news. And definitely know that this is a result of Nixon ordering the bombing of Cambodia. And this made many Americans begin to question the government, the bombing of Cambodia, because why is the U.S. getting involved in a neutral country? As a result of this, the Senate repeals the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave a lot of power to the president. And also in 1971, we have the issuance of the Pentagon Papers. And these were secret papers that revealed that there were mistakes and deception of the administrations of JFK and LBJ regarding Vietnam. It painted these presidents in a very bad light. All right, an important term that you should be familiar with is détente. And on February 21st, 1972, my birthday is 10 years later in 1982, Richard Nixon visits China. He seeks to improve relations with China. Keep in mind, this is very surprising because Nixon became famous by being a communist hunter. So he hopes to improve relations between the United States and China. China, again, is a communist nation, and he hoped to kind of use this against the Soviet Union. Then he begins a policy known as Détente, which is easing of Cold War tensions. And here is Nixon meeting with Brezhnev, the leader of the Soviet Union. And one thing that these leaders agree on is an anti-ballistic missile treaty, and they signed an agreement known as SALT, or the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, which becomes a treaty. And this limited the number of long-range nuclear weapons. Absolutely be familiar with SALT. All right, a new team on the Supreme Bench. We're going to shift to the domestic policy and the court. The Warren Court pictured here, front and center, is Chief Justice Earl Warren, beginning in 1953, and it goes to 1969. That's how long he was Chief Justice. It's important to note that the decisions of the Warren Court increased rights for criminals and the accused, and also affected religion, civil rights, and women. So we're going to go through several court cases, just be able to identify the theme of each of these. Mapp v. Ohio deals with search warrant. Gideon versus Wainwright allows defendants to have a lawyer even if you cannot afford one, so this provides for a public defender. Escobedo versus Illinois states that individuals have the right to a lawyer from the time they are arrested, so you can ask to see your lawyer. Miranda versus Arizona, one of the more well-known decisions. This is the right to remain silent, and this, as a result of this court case, police officers have to read you what is known as your Miranda rights or your Fifth Amendment rights when you are arrested. New York Times versus Sullivan stated that public figures had to prove malice or intent to harm in order to sue for libel or something that is said bad about them. Engel versus Vitale stated that school-sanctioned prayer is unconstitutional in public schools. It doesn't say you can't pray in public schools. It simply says that public schools cannot sanction or force this. Griswold versus Connecticut deemed birth control legal, and Tinker versus Des Moines deals with the Vietnam War, in which students were protesting by wearing black armbands, and they were suspended for it, and the Supreme Court said free speech is fine in school. And Nixon was very upset with the Warren Court decisions, and he was able to appoint new judges, and he did so, and he tried to appoint judges that he felt would strictly interpret the Constitution. So after Warren is no longer Chief Justice, he appoints Warren Burger. And Warren Burger kind of makes Nixon upset in the court case Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion. When it comes to the Great Society programs that were around during LBJ, Nixon really kind of kept some of them intact and even increased spending on some of them, most notably food stamps and Medicaid. So he did not limit them, and he actually increased spending on them. He instituted something known as the Philadelphia Plan, in which construction unions had to provide a timetable for hiring black apprentices. And some people believed he did this to drive a wedge between unions and African Americans. And eventually this is implemented in all federal contracts, that they had to provide a timetable for African Americans to be hired. Under Nixon, we have a new definition of affirmative action. Affirmative action was originally meant to make sure that minorities would not be discriminated against, and under Nixon's administration, you see it taken a step further, in which minorities are given certain privileges. When it comes to the environment, under Nixon's watch, the EPA, or the Environmental Protection Agency, was created, and this was influenced by Rachel Carson, this author here, and she wrote a book called Silent Spring. Absolutely be familiar with Silent Spring. It's about the environment. It has been on many released AP exams. Nixon in the economy, he instituted a 90-day wage and price freeze to try to improve the economy, and he took the United States off the gold standard for which we have been off since his administration. In 1972, Nixon runs for re-election. Also, it's a very important year. North Vietnam crossed the demilitarized zone into South Vietnam, and the U.S. responded by bombing the crap out of North Vietnamese cities. So they heavily bombed these cities. The election of 1972, Nixon campaigns with saying peace is at hand and it will be here very soon. And he runs against George McGovern, a Democrat who promised to end the war in 90 days. And Nixon wins in a landslide. On January 23rd, 1973, 3 days after Nixon is inaugurated for his second term, there's a ceasefire agreement in Vietnam. And Nixon claims that he has achieved peace with honor. So a way for the United States to leave, to have peace with Vietnam, but still do it in an honorable way. All right, let's go back to Cambodia and the War Powers Act. Between March of 1969 and May of 1970, the U.S. secretly bombed Cambodia 3,500 times. And they did this while the administration was denying that this ever happened. When Americans found out about this, they were very upset, and it leads many of them to question the government. In response, Congress passes something known as the War Powers Act, which essentially overturns the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. This drastically reduces the wartime powers of the president, and the president must report to Congress within 48 hours of sending troops to a conflict. So he has to let Congress know why he sends troops into a conflict. Furthermore, they cannot stay there longer than 60 days, and it could only be extended to 90 with the approval of Congress. So this is a way of taking back some of that executive power that the president was given from the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. Okay, so we have Syria and Egypt. They attack Israel, and the U.S. provides $2 billion in aid to Israel. Arab nations respond by enacting an oil embargo on America, and you see long lines at gas stations. And here's a picture of signs that you can see at gas stations. If there was a green flag, anybody could come and fill up. Yellow flag, only trucks and cars could. And red flags, there's closed, there is no gas. So imagine going to a gas station and there is no gas. As a result of this embargo, oil and gas prices increase drastically. Let's go to Watergate, very important event in U.S. history. On June 17th, 1972, 5 men broke into the Democratic headquarters in Watergate. Here's the building down here. It's an office and apartment complex. These guys were part of CREEP, which is the Committee to Re-elect the President. This was Nixon's campaign. And eventually it is traced back to Nixon himself. And we have the Vice President, Spiro Agnew. He resigns over taking bribes while he was governor and vice president. And this leads to the appointment of Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford was the first president to ever not be elected by the American public because he was not elected to the vice presidency. And one thing that comes out during this Watergate scandal is that Nixon was a very paranoid man, and he secretly recorded most of his Oval Office conversations. So those are subpoenaed, and it is revealed that Nixon was in on the Watergate scandal. During this, he fires many members of his cabinet, including a special prosecutor and the attorney general and the deputy attorney general, all because neither of them would fire this special prosecutor. Nixon claims that he shouldn't have to overturn those tapes under his executive privilege, but the Supreme Court said, no, bro, you gotta turn them over, that he could not withhold evidence and tapes. Shortly after, the House committee draws up impeachment charges. Nixon realizes he will be the first president in United States history removed. He will not be the first one impeached. And again, impeachment does not mean you are removed. It means charges are brought against you. So Gerald Ford becomes president, the first unelected president in U.S. history. And one of the first things he does is pardon Richard Nixon of any crimes he may have committed while he was president. This upsets many Americans, and some of them believe that there was a deal involved with this. And here is a very famous button that you would see, pardon me, Gerald, and you see Watergate and these criminals are breaking in. So Gerald Ford took a lot of heat for this, and this hurt his re-election chances in 1976. The Helsinki Accords were in the 70s, and this improved relations between Western nations and communist nations, especially the United States. So again, this is an example of détente. In 1973, the U.S. finally withdraws troops, and in 1975, North Vietnam completely takes over South Vietnam, and Vietnam becomes one communist country. And it does so at a cost of $118 billion, and 56,000 Americans died, and more than 300,000 were wounded as well. We're going to jump over to women in the 1970s. Title IX prohibited sex discrimination in education, so you would see equal opportunities for women and girls athletics. Still around today, has huge impacts in American education systems. The Equal Rights Amendment is passed during this time, and this is an idea that had been around for a very long time, going back to Alice Paul in the 1920s. So this is passed by Congress and is sent out to the states. The amendment eventually, after several years, the amendment does not achieve ratification. It fell 3 states shy of ratification, and this was a very famous slogan that you would see, this Stop ERA Amendment. And a very well-known woman that you should be familiar with is Phyllis Schlafly. And she was an outspoken critic of the ERA. She believed that would help destroy families. Roe versus Wade, 1973, talked about it earlier. This is when the Supreme Court legalized abortion, and again, they cited a woman's right to privacy. During the 70s, we have a term that's known as white flight, in which this is the movement of whites from cities to suburbs. We have the Regents of the University of California versus Bach, and this is giving preferential treatment based solely on race was not allowed. So Bach was a white individual who sued the Regents of the University of California, believe it or not, and he said he was denied admission because he was white. So the Supreme Court says you cannot allow somebody into your university simply because they are black. However, race could be one of several factors in admitting students. So let's jump ahead to 1976 with the presidency of Jimmy Carter. Here's Jimmy. He campaigned as a Washington outsider. He was a former peanut farmer and governor of Georgia. So he says, look, I am this clean individual. I'm not associated with any of this bad stuff in Washington. And he becomes president. He defeats Gerald Ford. Immediately, he pardons many draft dodgers from the Vietnam War, many people who fled to Canada, and he pardons them, and they could no longer be facing criminal charges. Camp David Accords, absolutely know this. It happens in September of 1978. This is a peace agreement between Israel and Beijing here and Egypt over here with Anwar Sadat. This is a very, very important milestone in which Israel signs an agreement with another Middle Eastern country. The Panama Canal is an issue during Carter's administration, and the U.S. promised to return the canal back to Panama by the year 2000. Inflation is something that happens drastically during Carter's administration. He is really hurt by the economy. There's also some problems in Iran, going back to when the United States backed this guy, the leader Shah Pahlavi, from 1953 to 1979. He was the leader of Iran, and the U.S. actually helped institute him as a dictator leader in 1953 when the CIA played a very important role. He was a pretty brutal dictator, and many Iranians were not a fan of him. The Shah was overthrown in 1979, and he has cancer, and the U.S. takes him into the United States and provides cancer treatment. This infuriates many Iranians, so much so that on November 4th, 1979, when this guy, the Ayatollah, is the new leader of Iran, many Iranians, younger Iranians, were very upset, and they overtook the U.S. embassy. And they held these 52 Americans hostage for 444 days, I believe. They actually released the hostages when Ronald Reagan was being inaugurated. During this time, there was this botched rescue plan when the Americans tried to rescue the hostages, and 8 American soldiers were killed in this botched rescue plan. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which is often called the Soviet Union's Vietnam War, this happens in December 27th of 1979, and the U.S. then boycotts the upcoming 1980 Summer Olympic Games in Moscow. And again, this war is seen as the Soviets' Vietnam, and this completely reverses any progress that was made under Détente. And we'll pick this up in the next chapter in the 1980s. That is a major focus of the 1980s. But before we sign off, let's do a quick review. Definitely know that the War Powers Act overturned the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Know that the Cambodia bombings led to the Kent State protests. The Warren Court improved more rights for criminals and the accused. Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring, which was a book about the environment. Phyllis Schlafly, be able to identify that she protested the ERA and campaigned vigorously against it, and that Gerald Ford pardoned Richard Nixon, and that hurt his re-election. Camp David Accords between Egypt and Israel were a part of Carter's administration, as well was the Iran hostage crisis. All right, thank you guys very much for watching. I hopefully was able to clarify chapter 39 for you. If you've not already, please take a moment and subscribe to my channel. Help me spread the word. If you know anybody that would benefit from this, please share this video with them. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in this section below. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.